Welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, September 11th, 2023, and today we are going to be talking about President Donald Trump and his endorsements from the 2022 elections, the 2020 elections, and the 2018 midterm elections. Now, the reason why this is of a topic of interest is because for a while now we have a general understanding about Donald Trump's influence on the Republican Party, that there is a benefit in the GOP primary, but a detriment in the general election for many of these candidates and some of these really close and competitive races, whether on the House level, the governor level, the Senate level, and in some cases, even state legislative races where you see some direct impacts of Donald Trump's endorsement in these races. Now, this is an analysis from Philip Bump. He's a columnist for the Washington Post, went to Ohio State, and generally deals with a lot of data and understanding the analytics behind political strategy and political motivations. Now, this is in the Washington Post. You can find this article. It was published just around a week ago, but I just got around to reading it, and I found it to be very fascinating, and I wanted to share it with you all because it pretty much reaffirmed a lot of what we know, but put an actual number, quantified, this Trump endorsement effect, telling people about how it helped them win in primaries and lose in November, depending on who was endorsed. Now, the cover photo, I think, is the perfect representation of how Donald Trump's influence can actually make a meaningful impact on the Democratic Party's electability and the Republican candidate's electability for the first 6 months of their campaign going into the primary. And it's because he's posed with Kari Lake, the GOP candidate for governor in the state of Arizona, right at the top on the New York Times page, who lost by 0.67% in the 2022 midterm elections. Now, you might be thinking, okay, President Donald Trump endorsed her, and she got very close, which is good, right? Maybe it was just a fluke election. And a fluke it was, but not in the sense that Kari Lake was coming from behind. She was in the lead throughout the entirety of the campaign season, was leading in the polls, doing very well, but she was put up even in that position in the first place because of Donald Trump's endorsement. What happened was that in 2022, not only in Arizona, but across the United States, Donald Trump made a list of candidates that he was going to endorse in 2022, whether that was J.D. Vance in the Ohio Senate race or Ted Budd in the North Carolina Senate race, or when it came down to the governor elections, numerous ones where he endorsed candidates to run in races. And while not all of them were the most successful, for instance, you can see that in the primary, some of them lost, didn't actually end up making it through. And many of them also lost their general elections. But Kari Lake individually was propelled to this very strong position in the GOP primary, largely because of Donald Trump's endorsement. She ran against Karen Taylor Robson, who surprisingly enough actually pulled in a significant amount of support despite Donald Trump's endorsements. Kari Lake was leading throughout the time frame. That's because Donald Trump handpicked her to be the nominee. And the nominee she was. It was a close race, about 4 points here, which means without the Trump endorsement, there's a strong possibility that she would not have been the nominee, but then she went on to lose the election again, despite leading nationwide. It's a story that can be told and told again and understood in many of these competitive races, because that's exactly what this study actually dives into. Now, they look at the 2022 midterms. They're talking about how Donald Trump had the worst polling numbers immediately following his announcement. And the reason was that he was running right after the 2022 midterms, which for many people was seen as cataclysmic for the GOP, in the sense that it should have been a lot better than what actually happened. If you need a reminder, Democrats gained seats in the U.S. Senate. The House barely went to the Republican Party. On the governor level, they lost numerous seats. So Donald Trump was the general common denominator when it came down to many of these competitive races, and was ultimately blamed by the national GOP. And thus, his numbers were actually in a pretty bad position. You can see that immediately following his announcement, he was within about 2-3 points of Governor Ron DeSantis. Today, that lead has expanded to roughly 40 points nationwide. And you can see, though, that they decided to dive deep into 2018, 2020, and 2022. They found that endorsed candidates here received a consistent and substantial electoral benefit in Republican primary elections, which we know. But again, putting it into quantifiable terms, we see it now being proven by this research in the race. But they found that the Trump endorsements eventually weren't as positive, saying that across all election cycles, his endorsements produced little benefit for candidates in the general election. In fact, they did not benefit financially and collectively received an aggregate vote share penalty of approximately 1.5 percentage points. You may think that's not a lot, but tell that to who would be Governor Kari Lake, losing the race by less than 1 point. It's something that I find to be so interesting and specific because of the fact that the Democratic Party was so close to losing, and yet somehow was able to win in numerous competitive races. 1.5% can really mean a lot. And I think looking at the actual chart here, they find the effect on primary elections were quite substantial. In every election that you see Donald Trump's endorsement here, that Donald Trump benefited candidates in 2018 by roughly 11 points, in 2020 by nearly 15, and in 2022 by around 13 points. That again makes all the difference. It was all the difference in the races, but in the general elections, you can see that overall you're talking about a 1.5% decrease. In 2022, it was roughly around there as well. It was kind of worse, actually, in 2020. And it was fascinating to think about because Donald Trump likes to handpick winners. If you take a look at a lot of his endorsements in the races, we can actually see here, he does a very good job at choosing people in general elections who we already know are going to win. For instance, in Arkansas, he chose Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Now, she was probably going to win that nomination regardless because of her impact in the administration and her well-known name nationwide, but he obviously chose the winning candidates. He also endorsed Kim Reynolds. Duh, she was the incumbent, right? Kristi Noem, the incumbent. Henry McMaster, the incumbent. Kevin Stitt, the incumbent. And the reason why that's so important is because the Trump campaign likes to get it right. They like to be endorsing the right candidate. So when you see numbers like this, number one, we have to recognize that, hey, this was meant to be a fail-safe. He only endorsed the people that he genuinely thought had a realistic shot at winning their elections, which meant that he made a number of political miscalculations as well. Not only did those candidates, by fully taking in that endorsement, have those political miscalculations, but Donald Trump as a candidate or as a presidential candidate, whatever it might be, as someone who has heavy influence within the GOP, he knew exactly what he was doing. He, at least in some people's eyes, knew exactly what he was doing, and it's very clear here that this might actually come as a shock to him as well, because he likes to tout his 95% election rate in endorsements, which we know just simply isn't true. And it says, granted, the negative effect was small, but it was not zero, which is why I say this matters. Again, looking at some of these races, it wasn't just, we don't even need to look at the Wikipedia list here. We can just go from race to race because we remember them. We remember how significant Donald Trump's endorsements were in some of these races. We see that it doesn't just, start with the general elections. It starts with the primary elections. Where did this bump actually happen? Sure, there was a negative effect of the endorsement, but why were these candidates so bad in the first place? Well, again, because of Donald Trump's endorsements. And people think, okay, maybe it doesn't matter, but we're actually going to go back to this list here because I want to show you some of the closest primaries that I think tell you why it's so important to, number one, see how impactful Donald Trump's endorsement is. For instance, Dr. Oz was in this race here. Now, he was, a very recognizable figure, but he certainly wasn't the most well-liked, the most well-received, and as the general election told, wasn't exactly the best candidate for the job. The polling numbers here had Dr. Oz winning by about 2.6%. By the end of it, he ended up winning by less than 0.1%. And the reason, again, why that so matters is because Donald Trump clearly had a positive impact. You can see that on average here, and you can apply this to the state of Pennsylvania, that Mehmet Oz was propelled to the nomination by Donald Trump's endorsement. That Kari Lake was propelled to the nomination by Donald Trump's endorsement. These very competitive races were competitive because Donald Trump made these candidates way more electable in the first place. Dr. Oz would have never been that GOP nominee, as we can prove mathematically, without the Trump endorsement, unless he's some type of super amazing figure well outside the anomaly. That simply isn't the case. Now, in North Carolina, it's a bit different of a situation. The Republican primary here actually was a good choice for Donald Trump. He chose the right candidate. But it's about the change in direction of the primary race following Donald Trump's endorsement. When Donald Trump endorsed Ted Budd as a congressman, he was a nobody. He was someone that the Trump campaign had fielded and recognized that he had potential. He was endorsed in April of 2021. We can see that he started out with 9 and 5% support statewide. That's not exactly the best place to be, and we know that. But what you found is that following the endorsement, he skyrocketed to 19%. And as the article suggests, it increased over time to 21, to 25, to 33. And then by the time we had reached the next year, Congressman Ted Budd was defeating, guess who? The former governor of the state of North Carolina. Pat McCrory finished in the primary here, you can see, with just 24.6% of the vote to Ted Budd's 58.61%. An endorsement can absolutely make a difference. And even when it comes down, not only here, but also endorsements in 2020 in 2018. There's a very notable one. If you don't, remember, Ron DeSantis won his runoff election because of his endorsement by Donald Trump. You can see that had a super, super significant impact, and it was one that really benefited Ron DeSantis. You can also see that, let's see if we can find it, in the state of Georgia, there was a huge benefit for Governor Brian Kemp when it came down to the Georgia race in 2018. So all around, Donald Trump did have some successes in the past, but it wasn't always there. It shows that his endorsements did have a negative impact on the GOP. It showed that there was a withdrawal. And again, 1.5% does not seem like a lot, but I implore you to look at just how competitive some of these extremely close races were. For instance, in Colorado's 8th district, which was won by 0.69%, that 1.5 could have made all the difference, right? In Connecticut's 5th district, 0.79%, that could have made all the difference. You keep going through and you see 0.7%, right? D plus 2 races that could have slightly turned around. D plus 0.83. This was supposed to be a race where FiveThirtyEight gave the Democrat a less than 1% chance at victory. What happened? She ended up winning. And again, that matters. It makes all the difference. New York, where the campaign completely collapsed nationwide, Pat Ryan won by just 1.3%. What you're finding here is that Donald Trump's impact and influence in many of these competitive races were so substantial that they lost the races for the GOP. And that 1.5% includes candidates that were reasonably set for the general election, reasonably able to do well enough on their own. But there were some particular people that Donald Trump propelled to the nomination. For instance, in the 2022 Michigan races, we can see here, let's find it. I'm trying to look for the competitive one. Let's see, it's probably in the Democratic column here. Hillary Scholten ended up winning the race. John Gibbs was the Republican nominee. Now, if you don't know a little bit of the backstory here, Peter Meyer, if you are from the Midwest, you know who the Meyer family is. At least you know Meyer. John Gibbs primaried Peter Meyer. Peter Meyer was the Republican incumbent GOP representative from the 3rd District of Michigan. He had won here in years past, and the district was absolutely winnable for the GOP. But John Gibbs, propelled by, this pushback against Peter Meyer. Why? Because Peter Meyer had voted to impeach Donald Trump. The entire Trump wing coalesced around John Gibbs. What happens? He ends up winning the primary, shockingly enough, but losing the general by 13 percentage points. Donald Trump's impact on the party has been poisonous in more ways than one. Electorally, we see that the one person who, again, we all see the common denominator and negative impact of his endorsements in the general election is now leading the national party. Isn't that something? Donald Trump is up 39.5% nationwide, on track to a resounding 54% advantage. You find that this is so substantial, so significant, and yet, for some reason, he is in this position not because he provides electability to the GOP, not because he won the last election, but because he has been able to spin the narrative. The narrative that he is somehow the better candidate than Ron DeSantis, who won his race by 20 points. Sorry about the Google Calendar notification. Didn't mean for that to go off. I'm going to turn my volume off now. And all these other candidates are in a pretty bad position. They're trying to make this argument to the American public, hey, Donald Trump is a poison to the party, the Republican Party, whatever it is. But it isn't working. Donald Trump is a spin master, and everybody knows it. It's difficult to crack this big coalition around the former president, and it simply isn't budging. We can see that the numbers here very clearly favor Donald Trump, even if the actual numbers in elections just don't. We're reminded of Herschel Walker's loss in the state of Georgia. We're reminded of Dr. Oz's loss in the state of Pennsylvania, of Blake Masters' loss in the state of Arizona. We're reminded that Tim Michaels in Wisconsin lost to the Democrat who was supposed to lose. Everybody had him in the losing column, including myself. He won by 4 points. You take a look at Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania. Not only did he lose, he lost by 15 in a state that President Biden won by just 1 percentage point. It again was put forward by the Make America Great Again crowd and President Donald Trump. You can see this all across the United States in many of these close and competitive races, or at least what were supposed to be close and competitive. Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer defeated Tudor Dixon by 11 points. If you've been watching, you know that I have been very, very big on this, discussion around Donald Trump's endorsements, why they are a poison in many ways to the GOP. because the numbers clearly prove it. While a 1.5% average loss for the GOP in the general election may not seem like a lot, it certainly makes all the difference. It made all the difference in those close and competitive House races. It made all the difference in those Senate races, those governor races. It made the difference. And the Republican Party, without Donald Trump, would likely be in the majority today, would likely be controlling both the House and the Senate and numerous more governorships. I mean, Democrats gained practically all across the board except for the House. And there's one person who they can thank for that. And it's the person who's about to be the GOP nominee for president in 2024. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.